Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Let's go discover the canyons of the American Southwest. Presented by Nat Hab's Field Operations Manager, Corbin Hawkins, and Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Matt Turner. It's a great pleasure to have you both with us today, and I'm going to turn things over to Corbin.
Yeah, thanks, Kendall, and thanks for having us. This is a fun one. I had the distinct pleasure of working with Matt for the first time in a while here. And I've actually taken this trip with him, so we kind of get to not only talk about moving forward with these trips, but we kind of get a chance to reminisce a little bit on some of our time spent in the Southwest. But first, just like to take a moment and introduce myself. I'm Corbin Hawkins, the Field Operations Manager for Natural Habitat Adventures. What that means is I got my hands in a little bit of everything. Sometimes I'm up in working in our polar bear trips or U.S. national parks or Greenland, whatever it may be. But in this COVID pandemic, I spent a lot of time in front of the camera here speaking about all of these great trips. And again, today I'm working with Matt Turner. So Matt, give us a little insight about yourself, what you do for Nat Hab, and what you've been up to recently.
Well, thank you, Corbin. And yeah, I live in Arizona currently, and I live in a place called Prescott, which is in the central part of the state. And I've been working for Nat Hab for, I'd say about 7 years or so now, and running the canyon trips and then also Yellowstone trips as well. During times of COVID, things have backed off significantly, as we all know, and my work now centers on land protection and working with a local land trust, dealing with conservation easements and things like that. So that's what I'm doing now, but I very much am looking forward to returning to the field and getting back out there again with all of you and running trips. And Corbin, you've, what the heck have you been doing during all this time?
Well, when I'm not sitting here talking to knowledgeable people like yourself, I've been working for an arborist on the side, so at least I'm outside. But I certainly miss working with you guys, and I'm sure you're getting a little tired of staring at a computer screen, hey?
I am at times.
Well, Matt, I know that I think you probably spend more time running these trips than anywhere else, and I know that this is a really special place for you, and you really like these itineraries. So let's talk a little bit about the why. What brings you here? What you live in the area? Why do you like it so much? And what are you excited to show people when you prepare for these trips?
Yeah, I've been living in the Four Corners region in the Southwest for over 30 years now. And throughout that entire time, my connection to this place has always been quite profound. And I've always shown a keen interest in all things Southwest. And for me, it's been a really great journey thus far, both in my own personal experiences in the region and then also working as a guide. And so for me, being able to share my experiences, my lifelong passion of being in this region is critical for me. It's so important in that I get to convey what I know and get to share time with all of you out in the field and see how you all get to react to everything that we see out there, whether it be the beautiful scenery or things like particular plants that I'm pointing out here. So it's a lifelong journey and a really unique one, and I assume I'll be here for the rest of my life and hopefully guiding for the next 10, 15, 20 years or so, who knows. So yeah, I'm very much a part of this landscape, and I love it dearly. So.
And something I've always appreciated about your love for this place is the images that you create. So for those of you listening, if you see in the bottom left corner there, there's a website to Matt's photography page, and then also his Instagram handle if anybody cares to further delve into his photography work. But you're about to see quite a bit of it. Anyway, so Matt, I know that you're a huge geology buff. I think one time I said, Matt, I know you love geology, but we really need to order dessert now. So let's move. geology topic. But you can't really, you know, a lot of our trips that we do with Nat Hab are wildlife based, but this one is really more about the land. So give me a little bit of the lay of the land, so to speak, and kind of lay out the trip for me.
Yeah, so I thought that we'd kind of start at a big picture level and just kind of give you a better idea of where we operate with this particular trip and how it fits in the greater context of a place called the Colorado Plateau, which is a 130,000 square mile area centered in the Four Corners regions of the American West and Southwest. And this image here, which I think is a fantastic image, shows you the crosshairs in the middle of the map, which is basically the Four Corners with Colorado. They're all named out. You can probably see it. And then within that area, you can see kind of a lightened area with a faint outline that encircles the plateau region. And within it is a lot of national parks and monuments and state parks. In fact, the highest concentration of national parks and monuments anywhere in the world can be found in the Colorado Plateau. If you look towards the left side along the Utah-Arizona border, you'll see Zion National Park, Bryce Canyon National Park, and then of course Grand Canyon down in Arizona. And that's where our trip is centered, is in that part of the Colorado Plateau on the west side of the plateau region. And what's cool is that not only are we interfacing or traveling on the plateau, but we are also traveling in off the plateau in another place called the Basin and Range, which is kind of an amazing place in itself. So with that, we'll focus in a little bit more and go out of the big picture view and move into something a little closer in perspective. And that is the region is known for its geology, of course, and the plateau region is made up primarily of what is known as sedimentary rocks. And sedimentary rocks are basically rocks that are made up from sands or other materials that are eroded from mountains and carried down and redeposited, and then they turn into stone through a variety of means, and then they begin piling up through time. And as that continues to pile up, the rocks eventually, even though they may be buried way down deep, they eventually get brought up high. And once they are brought up high, erosion and weathering can begin to work on those rocks and begin to carry all that material away that was originally solid. And then canyons and cliffs and all things begin to develop that ultimately lead to the landscape we see today. Now, this grand staircase that you see here on the left side is a fairly thick sequence of rocks. We're talking almost 9,000 feet, 10,000 feet of sedimentary rocks that are piled up on the left side of the image. And as you work to the right, they begin to thin out and taper. And from the top left, you'll see names called out, identifiers, one being Bryce Canyon, another Zion Canyon on the left side, and on the right side is the Grand Canyon. And you'll notice that, for instance, the Grand Canyon rocks are exposed at the surface on the right side at Grand Canyon, but as you work left, they become buried underneath another 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 feet of rock that's piled up on top of it. So the Bryce Canyon area is the first stopping point that we typically go to on our trip. And that is at the very top of this big stack of rocks. And of course, down low is old, up high is newer rocks, so younger in age. And Bryce Canyon rocks are the youngest rocks in the stack, and they're about 40 million years old, which is still pretty old. But Bryce Canyon, the first stopping point, is really quite unique in that the geology is made up primarily of this. This is a beautiful panorama of Bryce Amphitheater. The rocks are made up of what are known as ancient lake bed sediments. And those sediments are relatively soft and they weather and erode easily. And what it's doing is that the weathering from rain and snow is working on these soft sediments and basically creating this really unusual landform that we see here, which is Bryce Canyon. And, you know, we go into a lot more detail as we're on the ground looking at these places, trying to get a better understanding of what the heck is playing out here, because, you know, for many people who come in and they see it for the first time, they're just blown away by the intricacy of the landscape and things like what we see here, which are made up of fins and hoodoos, the tall, thin columns that are sticking up. That's all a byproduct of weathering and erosion on these soft rocks through time that have helped to create these unique features. It's pretty amazing. And that's actually a really cool trail that cuts right through there. You can see that thin line there. That's a trail system that works through these unique landforms. Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So,
fortunately enough, I've actually had the experience of being able to walk through that exact trail with you, and it's stunning. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I'm just going to say that you know, when we spend time here, there's a lot of different ways of partaking in this and enjoying this visually, and you can just immerse yourself in it and soak it all in. You can grab a camera and shoot photography, however you choose to do it. We give you those options, but it's a really fantastic place.
Yeah, the
so
right here is particularly special, in my opinion.
So, you know, on the next stop on the itinerary, we're just doing a real cursory kind of exploration of these spots, but the next place we go in our itinerary is Zion Canyon in Zion National Park. And Zion Canyon is in a different place in that stack. It's instead of at the top with fairly easily weathered soft rocks, now we're down in the stack and you'll see that numeric number of number 4, and that is a much harder rock. And harder rocks don't erode as readily as softer rocks. So as you work your way down into this canyon or down the stack, you move into something called the Navajo Sandstone. And you'll see with the images that we show that the canyon system is nearly 5,000 feet deep, which is pretty amazing. And it's all shear wall. And in the images that we have, you'll see how shear wall these cliffs are. And it is an amazing place. The rock, the Navajo Sandstone, is approximately 2,800 feet. I don't want to get into all the details. There's a lot of stacks of rocks in here. But the thing that really helps to create Zion Canyon is a river known as the Virgin River. And you can see the Virgin on the right side of the 2 slides that you see. And then on the left side is also the drainage system working down through the canyon floor and helping to slowly through time incise and cut into these sandstones and really create this dramatic scenery that we see here. And, you know, who knows in 100,000, 200, 300,000 years what this system might look like, but it could be shear wall cliffs that instead of 4,000 feet, they could be 6,000 or 7,000 feet. And it could be even become more dramatic in time, but it certainly is dramatic today. It's pretty amazing. Amazing place. Go ahead.
What are these peaks, Matt? I'm always blown away by Zion and all of these shear walls. Do you know the names of these individuals here, these peaks?
Well, the one on the right is called the Watchman, and it's a very famous peak. A lot of photography takes place here for your photo folks. This would be a place that we spend some time at. And then on the left side, it's just a whole bunch of different peaks. There's the eastern watchtower. I'm sorry, not the eastern. Actually, the watchtower in this view on the left side is way down at the end of the canyon there. So it kind of gives you an idea of how straight this canyon system is. But there's a lot of kind of peaks in there that aren't really in view that would be named certainly when we get on site. But this trail that on the left side that you're looking at is the Angel's Landing Trail, which is a very famous trail that takes you up to Angel's Landing.
Right.
It's quite dramatic.
Yeah.
Now, as we move into Zion Canyon, we'll be investigating, but more so just kind of looking out and checking out these really cool geologic features. And this place here with that person standing on that thin line is part of the weathering of what used to be ancient sand dunes. And so these are ancient dune environments deposited many millions of years ago. And today those ancient dunes deposits are now exposed at the surface, and they're eroding out in these unique ways. And these are dunes in cross section. And if you could go to a dune today in the Sahara or some other location, and you were able to cut through it and look at it on the side, this is kind of what you'd see. Pretty cool stuff. Yeah. So it's really, we get out on the ground and we see amazing places in Zion. Now, the next location that we go to is Grand Canyon. And Grand Canyon is at the bottom of this stack. And these are the oldest rocks in the big column of rocks that we know as the Grand Staircase. And the Grand Canyon rocks are quite old. And so they depict a part of the Earth's history that is really kind of amazing from a geological point of view. And I don't want to get into all the details on that, but we can tell you all about it when we get out on the ground. But, you know, the canyon is about 6,000 feet deep on the north side and about 5,000 on the south side. And at the very bottom of it is a river known as the Colorado River. And that river system and the canyon development has been probably, they think now, about 7 to 10 million years of time has since the establishment of the river system in Grand Canyon, and it's beginning to cut down into these rocks. It's probably about 7 million years. And you can see once again all this layer cake geology being exposed on the walls of the Grand Canyon. And that river system, the Colorado, which is down in that way down the left side, you can see another deep kind of dark forbidding gorge down there, and that's where the river lies. And it is cut down through all of this, which is really in a very short amount of period of time, approximately 7 million to maybe 10 million years. It depends on who you talk to. And it is just amazing to think about how all this sediment has been carried out through time. It's been eroded on, and it's unlike any other place in this country, in really anywhere in the world that I know of. It's pretty amazing, and the rocks on display are quite, it's fascinating. This is a view from the South Rim. Both views were from the South Rim looking into the heart of the Grand Canyon. And, you know, when we're on the ground and we're talking about things, we're going to talk about how the canyon developed, what you're looking at with some of the rocks you see, and even maybe get into things like fossils and things like that. So, yeah, pretty amazing.
For those of you listening, so, if you haven't been to the Grand Canyon, I mean, the pictures are stunning here, but standing on the edge, South Rim or North Rim, and it's worth noting that some of our itineraries will do both, but depending on when you travel. But something that always catches my eye when looking into these stellar canyons is the vegetation or lack thereof. It seems that the geology and the landscape here doesn't really afford dense vegetation, and if it were to, I think it would change the scenery altogether. But a word that you, in preparing this, Matt, something you've repeated over and over is the aridity of the region and its effect on the vegetation.
Right, yeah. Aridity is, you know, being in the Southwest and Intermountain region, aridity plays a really important part to not only the geology, because if you don't have a lot of rain, and if there's no rain or a lack of rain maybe in the form of maybe 15 to 20 inches a year, then vegetation is not going to be growing abundantly, which really helps to fix soils and fix everything in place. So if that's not there, then erosion works on the landscape in a big way, and weathering. And then the plants themselves, the vegetation that we see, is also adapting in all sorts of different ways to try and thwart basically drying out, because there's very little precipitation, particularly at the lower elevation areas. There's very little precipitation that falls on the ground that can be utilized. So plants at lower elevations are they have adaptations and different strategies like shallow root systems where they can absorb water quickly during a brief period of a summer thunderstorm. They also are more often than not, they are cacti that store water in their cells, and they are succulents. So there's a lot of different ways that plants are trying to stay basically from desiccating, is the word I would use. It's kind of a big word, but yeah, it's pretty amazing. So with these images that we are showing here, we're kind of working down from lower elevation areas, and we're going to kind of work upwards. But on the left side is a really beautiful plant called Sacred Datura. Also known as Jimson weed. It's a fairly common plant at lower elevations. In Zion, that's the Watchman again in the background. And then in Zion, you've got a pretty good elevational profile from about 3,800 feet down on the valley floors, like we're seeing here on the left, all the way up to over 6,000 or 7,000 feet at the top. So you got to remember that these big gradients, these elevations that we're seeing, you know, it's not going to be cactus growing all the way to the top to 7,000. There's going to be a lot of changes in the vegetation types or the plant communities that are found in these places. So as we move up, we're going to see less things like cacti and succulents, and we're going to shift upwards into things like conifers, like what we see here on the right is Ponderosa Pine. And in mid-elevation areas, the image on the right is not Ponderosa Pine. It's still, we're probably at about 4,500, 5,000 feet here. And remember, the average elevation of the plateau is about 5,000 feet, okay? So typically what you see out on the landscape is something like what you see on the right, which is that stunted little pine tree on the right is actually a juniper or a pinyon pine. And that's pretty common at 5,000 feet. As you move up in elevation, then you begin to see bigger trees like Ponderosa Pine and even some others. But on the left side is beautiful plants that grow in these semi-arid places like verbena, sand verbena on the left, and then on the right, the red flower is Indian paintbrush. Very, very amazing. And these plants are all quickly trying to get themselves into seed, into fruit, basically, or flower and fruiting and seeding real quickly, because they have a very brief season to be able to do all this before either it dries out in the summer months and gets too warm. And so their window is pretty tight for flowering plants in the area.
Matt, I
So,
think
yeah.
ahead of you there, did you want me to take a step back to the last shot with the ponderosas?
No, that's fine. But
Yeah.
just remember that ponderosas grow above the plants that we see on the right. So if we go to the next shot, and we're moving up in elevation, and now we're at Bryce, which is actually pretty high. So it's about 8,000 feet. And what we see up there is a really unique kind of plant vegetation community up there. And you got Ponderosa Pine growing kind of down on the right image, you'll see down in the valley in the amphitheaters. That's mostly Ponderosa Pine down in there. But as you get up on top of the plateau that makes up part of Bryce Canyon, that's a bristlecone pine right there, which is a really, it's been dated as one of the oldest living organisms on the planet. And there are a lot that are clonal that have been dated to 10,000 years, but as a kind of a single organism, this is dated, some of these bristlecone pine have been dated to 5,000 years. So, they're fairly rare, and they grow in these unusual sites at high elevation. On the left is another bristlecone. Actually, it's a limber pine, a relative of the bristlecone. And then in the foreground is a shrub called manzanita, which is, some of you may know, related to, well, in the West, there's quite a few manzanita species that we would see, but in the East, I'm not so sure. Maybe somebody in their questions could say, yeah, we've got manzanita relatives out here if you're living in the East or Midwest. I'm not sure, but anyway, so yeah, so what I'm trying to convey to you all is that it's really kind of amazing to think about the big elevational gradients that we are going to be driving through. Remember, low point 3,000, 3,500 feet at St. George, 8,000 feet at Bryce, and everything in between. And all along the way, along with the great geology, we get to see really amazing things like what we see here. And then, in addition, you have unique areas in the Southwest that do receive a little more water than your typical vegetation communities. And these are our springs and where our rivers and streams are flowing at the surface. The left side is an image of a spring or a seep pushing out of the canyon wall, the sandstone, the Navajo Sandstone. And the water has been perking down through this very porous sandstone rock unit through, could be thousands of years of time, till finally it gets to a place where it gets forced out horizontally as a seep or spring. And so this place that we're seeing on the left is wet throughout the year, and that allows unique animal or plants and animals to thrive there. And in fact, in time, they become adapted sometimes to this site, and they are become unique in their own species. So the stuff on the left is mostly ferns, and then on the right is a Zion shooting star, which is a fairly common plant. It springs and seeps in the region. Very, very pretty. Things like columbine. Yeah.
I'm continuously blown away with your knowledge of having been on these trips with you, and even in preparation of this webinar itself. Like just going through photos, you know every single name, you know the Latin names, you know where they come from, and all this stuff. So I'm constantly blown away. But to move along here from the flora, we've also got some fauna, and I know I touched on that at the beginning, saying that we don't see a whole lot of wildlife on these trips, but we do see some. And kind of in the same trajectory as the previous topics we've discussed. We'll start kind of in the low, unique areas and move on with the trip, and and see what we have the potential of seeing on these trips.
Yeah. So if we shift into the animals that live in this place. They too are trying to find ways of surviving in a dry environment. Fortunately for guys like canyon tree frogs here, or a gal, we don't know, but they live around the springs. So they do well around those sites. And of course, anywhere there's surface water, you're likely to see a canyon tree frog. Pretty cool. But once you move out of these wet areas, and back into the dry places, then animals are trying to figure out ways of surviving. So we're kind of starting down low again, and we'll work our way up. And this is in Zion, and this is desert bighorn sheep, and they're actually fairly common. We usually see them pretty regularly on our trips. And so there's a good bet we'll see some in Zion. And they're unique to their environment, and they have their own adaptations to be able to survive in this arid place. These guys, desert bighorn, were nearly extirpated throughout much of the range, mostly in the lower desert regions. They're a subspecies of the Rocky Mountain bighorn, so they're completely separate. They're about 30% smaller, and but they were nearly extirpated or nearly went extinct, not because of hunting, but because of the introduction to domestic sheep and all the diseases that come with domestic sheep. So they've rebounded, and there's been efforts by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state wildlife agencies to reintroduce them into places where they know there's no conflicts with sheep, etc. So pretty cool. So
I'm more familiar with the Rocky Mountain bighorn. You mentioned these guys have some special adaptations for living in the desert here. Would you mind just talking to that a little bit?
Sure. So, one thing that is common in desert environments around the world is typically organisms that are found there are much reduced in size. They're actually quite a bit smaller, and they take on their body mass and their surface area is reduced to reduce the potential for water loss, either through sweating or evapotranspiration, et cetera. But smaller body size is common. And the coloration on these guys is a lot more muted than you see with Rocky Mountain Bighorn. And they tend to blend in better with the surrounding landscape. And their main predators are mountain lion primarily in this part of the world. So, but you know, it's funny because Bighorn have certain adaptations, but you go lower in elevation and you go to desert environments and you see something like a jackrabbit and they have these huge ears, and they're using different strategies to try and reduce heat at their core by radiating heat away through their ears, which is kind of cool too. So animals are all using at elevation, and it, you know, it depends on where they are, and all sorts of different things are in play, but they're all kind of working their little schemes to basically survive. And I don't know if schemes is the right word, but that's what they're doing. So if we move into mid-elevation sites, kind of where the Bighorn were, and also up a little higher, we also in the Grand Canyon, remember Grand Canyon's 5,000 feet deep. So you've got 1,800 feet down at the bottom, 2,000, all the way up to almost 8,500, 8,700 feet up high. And in the middle of all that, you've got a pretty good zone where a lot of organisms are likely to be found in that pinyon juniper ponderosa pine woodland. But condors, which were reintroduced in the mid-90s, are now commonplace, and they are denizens of the Grand Canyon. They are an important part of not only the Grand Canyon ecology, in that they are obviously feeding on carrion and surviving that way, but they also create quite an appeal for people visiting the region. And you know, anybody who goes to the Grand Canyon now usually knows about condors. That's one of the big things that it seems in the press, and well, not, but just through time with the success of this species and its reintroduction efforts, it's become a you know, an important part of our conversation about Grand Canyon and areas around it.
Yeah,
pretty cool. Go ahead.
We spent quite a bit of time talking about these guys too, especially in World Wildlife Fund's some of their more recent work, and we don't need to speak to that right now. We'll get into some of that on these trips, I believe, but these are some of my favorite animals. It looks like it's right out of an African safari. You don't quite see something like this every day here in the States.
Yeah, it's another mid-elevation animal. Actually, they're up in Bryce, they're kind of found up to almost like around 7,000, 7,500 feet. So they can be higher in elevation. But yeah, they are a fairly common in grassland communities, and that are common in the west at mid elevation areas. And yeah, I don't want to go into all the really interesting sort of adaptations that this animal has taken on to, one, be the fastest land mammal in North America. You know, the question is why is that? And there's a really cool story that goes with it that you would learn if you were to travel on one of these trips. So pretty amazing. And yeah, I might get a question at the end of this saying, well, why are they so fast? So I might have to answer it. But yeah, they're an amazing animal. Yeah.
Both, it's funny actually, both being motorcycle guys, Matt, me and you, I always like to think of these animals as a little bit of a turbo engine. Maybe somebody will ask that question as we get towards the end.
I'm sure there's a good chance it's going to happen. So yeah, and then we have the cute, cuddly, not cuddly. I don't want you going up and when we're on the ground trying not to pet one, but they are prairie dogs, and these guys are found at Bryce Canyon area. They're fairly common, and so I like to say this is one of our big 5 wildlife sightings, right? What isn't in Africa? There's this is one of our big 5. Now somebody's going to ask, well, what are the other 4? So we'll see what happens with that one. But anyway, so yeah, they're fairly commonplace. These guys, they play an important part in the grassland communities that are found at mid-elevation. They are integral in, you know, creating good soil health. In other words, they till the soil, they bring soil up from depth and bring it out on the surface, so they're recycling soil. And then their burrows provide, you know, microhabitats for everything from insects and reptiles all the way up to cool birds like burrowing owls, which we might see on a trip like this. And so they're really integral to the landscape. And they someday, I hope that if, you know, these populations continue to rebound. There was a big eradication program with these prairie dogs throughout the West because of all sorts of weird myths about horses and cattle breaking their legs because they're stepping in prairie dog holes, and just silly stuff. And so there was big eradication efforts, and now they're rebounding. And the main predator on these guys are black-footed ferrets. So there have been reintroductions throughout the West and even around Grand Canyon region, and maybe someday we'll get to see black-footed ferrets also playing out their role in the ecology of, you know, mid-elevation sites and Bryce Canyon and other grassland communities. Pretty cool.
When you talk about eradication, I mean, really what you're talking about is the human influence on the wildlife. And while we won't belabor the point that we certainly have that impact, the human influence just in this region in general is quite dense. There's quite a rich history of folks that have passed their way through. And I know you love talking about this, so I'll give you a moment to just kind of tell me about who's been there and when and how and why and what's there today.
Yeah, yeah, I think that, you know, the story of the human survival or the human footprint in the American West is one of the more fascinating stories, but just mostly in terms of, once again, the aridity and how the aridity affects the way not only organisms like plants and animals survive, flora and fauna, but also the human experience. And so if you dig back in time to the first populating of the Western interior many thousands of years ago, we had archaic peoples coming in maybe 10,000 or 15,000 years ago or earlier, or the original arrival of people coming in from Asia. And then subsequent to that, we had this sort of building out of or populating of landscapes by, you know, people either coming in for the first time, or it could have been that somebody or a group of people moved through and went to one location and decided it didn't work and they came back. So there's a whole series as we move forward in time from 10,000, let's say, up to, let's say, around the time of Christ, then you have a distinct cultures that are living in this region. And we all know about Puebloan cultures in Mesa Verde to the east, and the well-known archaeological sites that many of you are aware of or possibly have even visited. And then to the west is other society or other groupings or cultures of people that weren't like the Puebloan people. They were hunter-gatherers, opposite of agricultural people growing corn and all that. But what's important is that these hunter-gatherers to the west and the agriculturalists to the east kind of converged in this place that we're going to be spending time in. And this rock art panel at Parowan Gap, where we go to, is a mix and match of a whole bunch of different rock art styles, or rock art is pecked in. So these are pecked in petroglyphs or glyphs that are pecked in through a patina. That brown surface is a patina that then can be pecked through, and you get the true color of the rock as you work your way through it. But this is a whole bunch of different cultures coming into this place because of its geography and leaving their inscriptions. And it's pretty amazing place. And there's a lot.
A subset of what you can actually see in this location. I mean, this just covered, the wall to wall covered in this, these great inscriptions.
Right, and so this is, you know, we get to see cultural sites in some ways, the ancestral sites, and there are some that are ruins ensconced away in cliff walls. But you know, part of the trip will be spent investigating or checking it out, you know, and letting you all learn a little bit more about the West and what it makes it unique. And so if we march forward into contemporary, the time of historic times, the peoples that live here, and basically the ancestors of the people that left the rock art are these people. And this is a Southern Paiute, and this is probably a small family group of, looks like a man and a woman. And in the background is a wickiup, which is a stick structure. They did not have the large game animals like you have out on the plains that would allow you to, like bison, to build teepees and other structures that most people are accustomed to. Their structures were made out of local vegetation, and a lot of them was just whatever they could get their hands on it at a particular location, which was often not much because a lot of these places are pretty arid. So this is how people lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years, especially out in the flatter places where you couldn't grow crops. You had to be on the move. And this is a lifestyle. This is a temporary structure. It went up in a few hours, and it may be left to return to later on as they're moving across the landscape, trying to find food to survive on. Pretty amazing. So, you know, in modern times with the Europeans, as they arrived in the region, we all know that, you know, the Spanish arrived in the Americas in the 1400s, but they really began to work into the Southwest region and explore it in the 1500s and on. And this is a depiction of an important party of Spanish priests known as Dominguez and Escalante, who established an important route out of the Spanish, the northern New Mexico Spanish sort of villages to California. Remember that California was where everything was happening, in New Mexico and the Southwest was kind of like this secondary exploration. So they were trying to figure out how to make a connection from northern New Mexico and the Southwest to California, where the ports were. So these guys were the first to establish this route. And we travel along this old trail called the Old Spanish Trail. And we get to see, in fact, Parowan Gap, that place we just saw the rock art, is where that trail went through. And these missionaries, and then later other explorers, went and used this trail as the primary route of travel in the West in the early time before, up until the late 1600s, early 1700s. And then as we march forward in the more modern period, in the 19th century, we have an important player in the region, a gentleman known as Brigham Young, who was the prophet for the Mormon people who moved into Salt Lake City in the late 1840s and began to develop the land. The state, he was trying to achieve statehood, and he wanted to call it Deseret, but he was actually kind of a funny side note on this. He was the prophet and leader of the Mormon church, but he was also the territorial governor for the Utah Territory, which there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there, especially if you're trying to secede from the nation. So it's kind of an interesting story. And then on the right is a man known as John Wesley Powell, who was an explorer, did the first major explorations of Grand Canyon, but he was also, more importantly, was an ethnographer, a man who wanted to understand and try to document the tribes, the peoples living in this region. So there's a whole story that the building out of the West and the settling of the West is a story unto itself, and particularly the Mormon story where we're traveling. And there's a whole, I don't want to get into too much, but it's a fascinating story to tell. It's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
Ultimately, this story culminates in our current ability to view these areas, whether it's Yellowstone or Yosemite or the American Southwest. We can attribute a lot of that to, at least in my opinion, maybe most to the influence of the trains and the infrastructure that was brought about, and it just provided a little more access. So tell me a little bit about this, what we're looking at here, Matt, and then I want to bring it all full circle and just kind of talk about what we get to do on these trips that we kind of owe in part to the development of this story that you've kind of just told.
Right, yeah. So, you know, the railroads helped to open up the West, and in many ways. And so in the 1870s, railroads arrived in a big way. The Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, lots of different Atlantic Pacific rail lines all started working to the coast, the West Coast, and then towards the east and the Midwest, and then the East Coast. One line that was laid down by the Union Pacific that went from basically Los Angeles to Salt Lake had a spur that came off of it, and you can see the Union Pacific system up at the top left, and then there's a little spur that comes off to a place called Cedar City, which we visit. And then from there, travelers in the early 1900s, because that was the primary route of travel, was by railroad, they got off the train at Cedar City, and then they boarded a bus and they did a tour of all the parks that we're going to see. So the parks and the road systems were built in part or funded primarily by the railroad. So many of the lodges that we stay at and the things that we see from the early days are from the funding of the railroads or by the railroads. Pretty cool.
Speaking of what we see, I mean, I think we've just covered a lot of what we can expect to see when we travel to this area. But what kind of activities can we expect to do? And you know, if I were to be taking a trip with you, Matt, what's up? Where are we hiking? What are we doing? What are we seeing?
Well, for one, I tell a lot more jokes, so we'll see. And yeah, I try to, you know, we certainly try to keep it entertaining, and we try to get you to unique locations. Like this gentleman here, this is a photography trip, and he was quite eager to get a shot from this location, and I had him. I was very careful with him, and but he got out there, and it was the most important part of the trip for him. And so the photography trips, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
No, go ahead. Yeah, you're good.
The photography trips are one such trip that is offered when probably we'll resume those in a big way once we get out of this COVID thing. And but this is one kind of trip that takes place, and then there are others as well. There's the current offering. Well, I'll kind of pull back and just say some of the activities we do. So there's photography, and then it can be active. It can be hiking, either on something that's a little more strenuous, like what you see in these images. Corbin, I'll let you talk about that lower left one.
Yeah.
And but it can also be less active. It can be, for those of you, we have 2 guides on these trips typically, and so guides can split and offer one kind of activity for a group of people that want to be more active and do something a little more strenuous, and another guide can offer another activity which is maybe more or less active, less strenuous, that might be sightseeing along the rim drive or the drive along north to south of Bryce Canyon. There is a horseback ride offering as well that's optional. And I think what's important is that we offer as much as we possibly can to all of you. And but it's all optional. It's all to your discretion. And if you bring up something to us that is something that you think might be worth your time and you'd like to go explore something on your own, we certainly would try to assist you in getting to either a location or possibly getting you to an individual or a person who provides a service. That could be a horseback ride or whatever you wish. And so we really are working with you at all times to try and make sure that you're happy and you're excited and you're getting to do what you want to do. With the same time, with a little bit of the notion that we're doing group travel. So a little bit of that added in. So so anyways, so it's really quite amazing. Corbin, you're
yeah, I certainly appreciate the flexibility, and I love guiding in situations like this in which you can be flexible and try to meet the needs of everyone. For me personally, when I took this trip with you, Matt, the highlight for me is that bottom left image that we see. That's Wall Street and Bryce Canyon. if you think back to the beginning of this webinar when Matt pointed out a trail system that ran through the amphitheater, and Bryce, this is how you access kind of the beginning of that trail. And it really is just a unique and sort of a special place that I hope that you guys can see it one of these days. Without further ado, Matt, we are kind of coming up on the top of the hour here. We'd like to open the floor for any questions that you guys may have for myself or for Matt. Kendall, I'll move it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got some good questions for you. And I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question for Corbin or Matt today, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, a lot of people want to know about when is a good time to visit, and in particular, about what month in the spring can we drive to the north side of the Grand Canyon?
Well, so the North Rim is closed till May. It's basically shut down, and the person who's asked that question may know that. So May is when it opens up. So it's basically shut down from mid-October to mid-May. And depending on snows, they may leave it closed even longer, but this year it looks like a normal year. But so the North Rim is accessible at that point by mid-May. We don't really start running trips there till a bit later. So, we have a new itinerary this year that takes us to the South Rim. And the North Rim is, at this time, is not going to be part of the itinerary, the upcoming itineraries for spring and early summer. And that is because of a lot of complexities that are associated with the COVID thing. So it's as you can imagine, with all our lives and the way COVID has hit all of us, it's also hit operators and people running trips like ourselves, and our ability to secure a lot of different things, like everything from reservations, etc. So we've been really trying to make something happen that keeps us at Grand Canyon, and we've now decided that we're going to go to the South Rim. One of the cool things about that is, I know I'm kind of going probably longer than I should, but one of the cool things about going to the South Rim is that we'll get to travel through Navajo tribal lands, and so the Navajo Nation, and we'll get to spend a little bit of time on the Navajo tribal lands, and it's quite possible that I know quite a few speakers that are Navajo, and I'm trying to figure out ways of trying to get Navajo speakers engaged with us, and certainly we're going to make a few brief stops along the way to learn more about the Navajo. That's something that is not part of the the itinerary, the North Rim itinerary. Did that answer the question? So let me just say one last thing. So as far as best times to travel, either in the spring or in the fall, I'd say that the way we do our bookings is, we've time tested, or we've tested these trips through the years, and we've determined that the trip offerings and the window that we offer them in are the best times to do it. I will say though that these early season trips, like in the spring, there's a chance that we, at high elevation sites like Bryce, you could very well encounter snow. And of course, as you move into the season, it gets hotter. But on the other end of the spectrum, because we have such a broad elevation range that we're working with, it may be nice and pleasant in Zion in the early spring, but by the time we get to the summer months, it could be quite a bit warmer in Zion, but pretty comfortable at Bryce. So there's a whole there's kind of right in the middle there, I would say it's probably the optimal time to travel, but it's all good because it all has its own unique flavor to it. Weather and the weather that affects this region can really make for some really exciting travel in lots of ways. So, and then in the fall months, it would be kind of the same. We have trips that are sandwiched in between, well, actually we kind of carry through all summer. I haven't yet to see the full itinerary yet because we're still working it out, but through the summer months, but in the fall as well, I'm sure we're going to be ramping up in a big way based on the COVID thing, and hopefully, the same will be true where we'll have a August to October window, and we've considered that to be prime time. That was kind of a long-winded answer, but hopefully I answered it.
That was great. So I'm going to combine a couple questions here. One is, what are the ADA or wheelchair access opportunities on this trail? And if one were to go on a trip with Nat Hab, what level of physical activity is expected? How physically fit does one need to be?
So as far as the first question is concerned, you know, all the locations that we travel to have wheelchair access. You know, of course, the trails that we are traveling on, I'd say majority of them are not wheelchair accessible. There are instances like rim trails where that might be the case, where that are fairly easy gradients or low gradient trails that are paved. But it's, I would say that it's probably going to push you a bit if that's the case, as far as utilizing a wheelchair. Now, the second question is the strenuousness of the trip is. I'd say that that it's. My expectation would be that if you can, you know, comfortably walk a mile on level ground, or maybe 2 miles in a day, because we are out on the ground quite a bit, walking around and doing site visits and checking things out. These aren't hikes. This is just normal day-to-day walking around and checking stuff out. I'm hoping that all of my travelers can do a few miles in a day, and then beyond that, and we can cater to those people throughout the trip by giving them opportunities other than hiking to give them the best experience possible. But it's basically from there and up. And then beyond that, as far as the other end, we can offer fairly you know, strenuous hikes in many of the locations that we visit. So it's I would say that all in all, it's probably not the most active. In other words, we're not going to be doing 6 to 10 mile hikes every day, but there will be opportunities for those of you for a number of days on the trip to be able to do a more strenuous hike or walk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, it looks like there's someone watching who says a group of them have signed up for the photo version of the canyon strip next year. They're going to be arriving a few days early. What other places would you recommend that they visit that's relatively close that will offer good photographic opportunities?
Well, if they're flying into Las Vegas, actually, maybe are they flying into Las Vegas, or where are they flying into, or where are they coming in from? And maybe they can respond with that. But you know, if you're coming into Vegas, en route to the region, there's a place called Valley of Fire State Park, which is awesome.
Beautiful.
Beautiful place. And then around Vegas, there's a place called Red Rocks, which is if you're there for a day or whatever. But as you move closer into the parks, there is a couple places that that you might consider visiting. One is Cedar Breaks, which we actually sometimes visit on our trips. And then there is more local hiking. I don't know if these people are hikers or if that's their angle, but there's a lot of hiking to be had, particularly around like Hurricane, Utah. And there's a number of great trail systems out there. There are great trails and hiking and sightseeing at a place called Red Cliffs Canyon Preserve. And then this is near St. George. And then in addition to another location that's in close proximity to St. George, I'm probably going too fast, is a place called Snow Canyon, which is a great place to check out, more red rocks and cool scenery. So I guess it really, one depends on where they're coming from. Vegas, there's a few opportunities in and around Vegas. Once you get on site into the region, and in the St. George area and Zion, there are lots of local opportunities for sightseeing and more so, even more so, hiking. It's a real kind of hiker's paradise. So, and so that's, hopefully there's a lot of Mormon history there too. So there's a lot of cultural stuff that if you do a little investigating online, you can quickly find out just the rich museums and other places to visit that have a cultural focus. Did that answer? Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, they just wrote in. It looks like they're coming from Jackson and they're flying south. There's some flexibility in where they're flying into. So I think that was probably very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
One last question about trips, and then I've got a couple wildlife questions before we call it a day, since it is the top of the hour. What's your suggestion for camera lenses to bring?
I will add, and Corbin, you certainly are willing to chime in on this. For landscapes, which is kind of the primary focus on the photo trips, it's obviously a wide lens is going to do you good. And so, if you can get yourself a 15 to 20 millimeter wide angle, and if it's a decent zoom up to 34 millimeters, that's great. If it's a prime lens, that's in the 18 to 24 millimeter range, that's great too. I think that the wide angle stuff is obviously important for landscapes. But then in addition, this sort of mid-range lens that is in the 24 to 70. If you don't have a wide angle, certainly a 24 to 70 or in that kind of zone would be very useful. You're still going to get wide angle shots. And in fact, if you really want big wide angles, you could just kind of maybe try and do a panorama where you're stitching a couple images together to get that sweep you want. And then, the long lenses for wildlife I think that wildlife is not as much of a focus. So certainly bring one if you have one, but if you certainly don't need to bring your 300 millimeter or 400 millimeter lens, unless you're really keen on capturing, wildlife, which in our part of the world is more in the birds and maybe small mammals and an occasional pronghorn and things like that. So, so wide angle, mid range, and if the way lenses are today, it's like, I just bought a 28 to 200 Tamron that is fantastic. So if you've got a 28 to 200 lens and it's totable, it's fairly lightweight for travel, bring it. So there's a lot of, I just say that landscapes will be a big focus. So Corbin, you got anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would say unless you're trying to really reach out and grab a bird in the distance or something like that, I would say 200 is, I basically carry three lenses, a 14, 24, 24-70, and a 70 to 200. And I found use in all three of those on my trips here.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah, it's, yep. Go ahead.
So you asked for it. What are the big 5 animals in this area?
Well, so the big 5 are the condor. I'm kind of just pulling them out of the hat here real quickly. So condor, the pronghorn, the canyon tree frog, now I got to throw an insect in there. Let's say the tarantula, and then of course the Utah ground squirrel, the Utah prairie dog. You're going to just be like, that was lame, but that's it. And we can change that as we travel, and we'll identify those. But that was my top 5 just then.
Okay, great. That works. And another one you asked for, why are the pronghorns so fast?
Pronghorn, and this is kind of an interesting thing to, when you get offline, you can do your own research, but they're, pronghorn evolved have been out on the North American landscape for, multiple species for millions of years. And, 10,000, 15,000 years and prior, in North America prior to the arrival of humans, which probably brought about the demise of these creatures I'm going to talk about, were a lot of big megafauna that some of you know of, like mammoths and mastodons and sloths. But then there were a lot of carnivores running around. And one such carnivore was something called the North American cheetah. It's not related to the old world cheetahs. It's actually more closely related to the panther or the mountain lion. It's kind of in that family. So, but it was a very agile and very fast carnivore out on the plains. And much like the cheetah in Africa and the animals that have evolved to avoid that animal, the pronghorn took on adaptations, one being speed to avoid capture and avoid being predated on by this very fast carnivore that is now extinct. So that's the gist of it. So type in, when you get a chance, type in North American cheetah and pronghorn, and there's actually a lot of great kind of general audience reads on the history of that. It's pretty cool. And then there was other carnivores that I won't get into, but there's some other players as well that probably pushed the sort of evolutionary drivers to push pronghorn in the direction they went, which is speed and speed for long periods. Cheetahs can go for a short while, but pronghorn can continue at a high rate of speed of over 50 miles an hour for many, many miles. So they are quite good at, and now there's nothing out there except for coyotes.
Something you shared with me years ago in relation to the pronghorn and their ability to keep that speed up is an increased lung capacity, which in turn is a higher output from the heart. So when I brought up the turbo engine, so to speak, essentially they have the capability to take in more air and output more, let's call it torque.
Torque, yeah, that works. I like torque. So yeah, any other wildlife questions?
You know, I think we're going to call it there. It's 10 minutes past the hour. So I really just want to thank you both for your time today. This was so interesting. I know this is such a beautiful and historic part of the world. So thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. I'm going to hand it back over to you for closing comments, and we're going to start with Matt.
Thank you. So Corbin, thank you for doing this. And I just want to say to all of you, I hope you gained a little bit. Sometimes there's a lot going on out here, and there's a big story to tell. And we try to tell a good story, and as well try to give you all a great experience. And so it's my hope that in the spring and in the coming months, as this thing that's been going on for the past year slowly begins to abate, we hope that I get to see all of you out traveling and enjoying a place like this. So thank you, appreciate it.
And thanks to you, Matt. It's great to be able to work with you again and sit down and have a conversation in the presence of our wonderful travelers. And you know, thanks to you guys for listening. This is really our passion. If you can't tell by Matt listening, then maybe we need to increase his joke limitations on these. But we really are passionate about this, and we love sharing this with all of you. And hopefully we get to do that in the field very soon. And as always, Kendall, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we'll see you guys later.
All right, thanks again, guys. Yep, and my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Yeah.